Northern Montana Territory, November 1887, 40 miles west of Fort Benton, where the Teton River cuts through wind-scraped prairie. A single-room cabin held a secret that would humiliate every experienced builder in the settlement. Outside, the cottonwood stood bare against a steel-gray sky. Inside, something impossible was happening. Margaret Brennan's cabin had no smoke rising from its chimney. Her woodpile, what little remained, sat untouched for days. Yet when Doc Halloran rode past during his rounds, he'd seen her daughter playing near the window, dressed in a light wool shirt, not the layers of fur and flannel every other child wore just to survive indoors. The settlement's blacksmith had a theory. She's burning furniture. Desperation. The mill operator disagreed. She's got hidden coal, probably stole it. But the strangest part? Nobody had seen Margaret haul water from the creek in over a week. For a widow with 2 children, that wasn't just unusual. It was impossible. What Margaret understood about heat storage would, within 18 months, rewrite how 43 families in the Teton Valley survived winter. But first, she had to endure something worse than cold. Being called a fool by every man who knew better. If you want to see the exact measurements that prove them all wrong, hit that like button and subscribe. Because I'm about to show you a frontier hack so effective, modern engineers are still catching up. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and I'll reply with a traditional heating technique from your region that actually worked. Margaret Brennan hadn't planned to reinvent anything. She'd planned to survive. Her husband, Samuel, had fallen through river ice the previous March while hauling timber, drowned before help arrived. He'd left her with 2 children, Ellen, age 9, and James, age 6, a mortgage cabin, and a woodlet contract she couldn't physically fulfill. By October 1887, her shoulder injury from a barn accident made splitting wood nearly impossible. Every swing of the axe sent fire down her left arm. The settlement's charity lasted exactly 3 weeks. Then the whisper started. She should move to town, take in laundry. A woman can't manage a homestead. But Margaret's claim required continuous occupation. Abandoning the cabin meant losing everything Samuel had died securing. The problem became specific on November 2nd, when early snow collapsed her woodshed. Half her winter supply got soaked, dense, wet cottonwood that wouldn't burn for weeks. Her remaining dry wood, maybe 40 days of fuel, as she rationed brutally and the winter stayed mild. It wouldn't stay mild. Old-timers were already reading the signs. Thick beaver pelts, birds gone south early, unusual ice patterns on the river. Montana winters didn't negotiate. They killed. Margaret's solution happened by accident. On November 4th, while boiling laundry water in her largest copper pot, she needed to clear space on the stove for cooking. She wrapped the pot in an old quilt and shoved it under the sleeping platform where the children slept. That night, Ellen called down, "Mama, the floor's warm." Warm. Not hot, warm. 8 hours after moving the pot, Margaret pressed her hand against the rough pine boards. Heat, gentle, steady heat radiating up through the wood. She thought about how long that water stayed hot, compared to how fast her stove cooled. Water in a closed pot, warm to the touch 12 hours later. Firebox stones, cold within 2. The idea forming in her mind seemed insane. But desperation makes mathematicians of us all. What Margaret built over the next 6 days looked, to any experienced frontiersman, like a woman losing her mind. She started with her late husband's metalworking tools, items she'd been told to sell. Using tin snips and a borrowed soldering iron, she fashioned a secondary tank from sheet metal salvage from a broken grain hopper. 18 inches tall, 14 inches square, sealed at every seam with lead solder, she melted carefully over low coals. The principle was simple. Heat water once, store it efficiently, let it radiate slowly. She positioned this tank directly behind her small cooking stove, separated by a 4-inch gap filled with river stones. When she cooked or heated wash water, the metal tank absorbed residual heat. But the real innovation sat beneath her children's sleeping platform. Margaret built a thermal bed, a shallow stone box, 8 inches deep, running the entire length of the platform. She lined it with flat river rocks, then added a layer of sand for even distribution. On top, sealed clay vessels filled with hot water from her tank. The wooden platform sat 2 inches above this heat reservoir, allowing warm air to rise through the gaps while the stone mass below absorbed and held warmth. Her final modification seemed strangest of all. She reduced her firebox opening and extended the stovepipe through a horizontal section, 18 inches of iron passing through a second stone box before rising to the roof. Every bit of heat that would have escaped straight up the chimney now warmed 40 pounds of sandstone first. The technical logic was sound. Water holds approximately 4 times the heat of an equivalent mass of stone, and stone holds roughly twice what wood does. By heating water once thoroughly, then using stone as a secondary battery, she created a system that released warmth for 15 to 18 hours from a single heating cycle. It looked like chaos: mismatched metal, stacked stones, pots wrapped in quilts sitting in sandy pits. To men who built hundreds of cabins using proper methods, it looked like desperation dressed up as engineering. The mockery started before she'd even finished. Jacob Thornton, the settlement's lead carpenter and a man whose opinion carried weight in Fort Benton, stopped by on November 12th. He'd heard Margaret was doing something strange with her stove. When he saw the stone boxes, the water tank, the modified firebox, he actually laughed. Margaret, water freezes. You understand that, right? First hard cold snap. Those pots crack. You flood your cabin, and that water turns to ice under your children's bed. This is how people die. She tried explaining thermal mass, heat retention, the mathematics of specific heat capacity, concepts she'd read about in Samuel's engineering manual from his railroad days. Thornton cut her off. Heat comes from fire. Fire needs feeding. This is washerwoman thinking applied to survival. It's going to fail, and when it does, you send Ellen to my wife. We'll take her in before she freezes. The mill operator, Dutch Kellerman, was less polite, seeing her reduce firebox opening. He shook his head. You're choking your draft. You'll fill this cabin with smoke and die in your sleep. This ain't a woman's puzzle to solve, Margaret. This is physics. Even Doc Halloran, usually kind, expressed concern. I've seen cold do terrible things. Whatever you're attempting, don't let pride kill those children. There's no shame in accepting help. The social judgment cut deeper than the technical criticism. Women in the settlement whispered that Margaret had gone strange with grief. Men said it louder. She's playing house with rocks and pots while winter's coming. That cabin will be a tomb by January. One comment stuck with her. Porter Davidson, a firefighter who'd seen cabins burn, said it cold and clear in front of witnesses at the dry goods store. That setup is a death trap. Sealed metal near combustibles, restricted airflow, water containers near sleeping children. You're building a disaster, and I'll be the one pulling bodies out when it fails. Margaret stopped explaining. She simply finished her work, laid in what little which she could still split, and waited. Winter would speak for her. The first test arrived November 28th, 1887. Not the worst cold Montana could deliver, but enough to separate theory from survival. Temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Cold enough that the river grew a skin of ice. Cold enough that poorly chinked cabins became unlivable without constant fire. Throughout the settlement, families woke to frost on the inside of their windows, condensation frozen into crystalline patterns on every piece of metal. Jacob Thornton's family burned through 8 hours of split wood before dawn, just maintaining 52 degrees inside their well-built 2-room cabin. Dutch Kellerman's outfit, 4 adults, 2 stoves, went through half a cord in 3 days. Smoke rose from every chimney in steady gray columns, except one. Margaret Brennan's chimney stood silent. Doc Halloran noticed on his 3rd day of rounds. He'd seen this before. Families too weak or sick to maintain fire, huddled under blankets waiting for help or death. He rode up expecting the worst, already planning which family could take the children. He knocked. No answer. He knocked harder, calling Margaret's name, preparing to force the door. Then it opened. Ellen stood there in a cotton dress, not the wool fur layers every child wore. Behind her, young James sat at the table eating porridge, barefoot on wooden planks. The cabin air felt comfortable. Not blazing hot like a room with a roaring fire. Just steady, breathable, warm enough that Doc's own breath stopped fogging after he'd been inside 30 seconds. "Where's your fire?" he asked. Margaret gestured to the stove. "Cold. Ashes from yesterday morning. Nothing burning now." She saw his confusion and walked him through the system. The water tank, still warm to touch 20 hours after heating. The stone bed beneath the sleeping platform, radiating gentle heat upward. The horizontal stovepipe section, its surrounding stones releasing absorbed warmth into the cabin. "I heat water thoroughly once a day," she explained, "usually while cooking breakfast. That's it. Everything else is storage and slow release." Doc pressed his hand against the sandstone box around the stovepipe. Warm, not hot enough to burn, but distinctly warm. He knelt and touched the floor near the sleeping platform. Also warm. The whole cabin had become a battery, holding yesterday's heat and releasing it so gradually that the interior never dropped below livable temperature. Outside, 12 degrees. Inside Margaret's cabin, by Doc's pocket thermometer, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Holding steady without any fire burning. This is where it gets incredible. Stay with me, because the numbers I'm about to show you didn't just surprise the settlement. They humiliated every expert who said it couldn't work. Hit subscribe right now, because you're about to see measurements that turn frontier common sense completely upside down. Doc Halloran was a man prone to exaggeration. 23 years practicing medicine on the frontier had trained him to observe, measure, and report facts. So when he returned to Fort Benton's Mercantile that evening, he brought his field journal, the same leather-bound book where he recorded temperatures during fever cases and frostbite incidents. The numbers he shared silenced the room. Margaret's cabin, 61 degrees Fahrenheit at 9 a.m., no active fire. By his second visit at 4 p.m., interior temperature had dropped to 58 degrees, a loss of only 3 degrees over 7 hours. Her last fire had burned out 16 hours prior. She'd used approximately 1/8 of a standard firebox load of wood in the past 24 hours. Total fuel consumption, maybe 12 pounds of dry cottonwood. Jacob Thornton's household, for comparison, maintaining 52 degrees required feeding the fire every 90 minutes. His family had burned through 63 pounds of split wood in the same 24-hour period, over 5 times Margaret's consumption, while achieving 9 degrees less warmth. Dutch Kellerman's situation was worse. His poorly insulated cabin, even with 2 stoves running, fluctuated between 47 and 56 degrees. His wood consumption over 3 days, estimated at 140 pounds. His family slept fully dressed under piled furs. Margaret's children slept in cotton nightshirts under a single wool blanket. But the measurement that truly shocked the settlement came from the thermal retention test Doc conducted himself. On December 1st, he recorded the cabin temperature at 7 a.m., 63 degrees, fire cold since the previous morning. Margaret heated her water tank beginning at 7:30 a.m., bringing it to near boiling, one small, efficient fire lasting approximately 40 minutes. By 9 a.m., fire extinguished, tank refilled and positioned. Doc returned at midnight. Cabin temperature, 59 degrees. 15 hours after the fire died, the cabin had lost only 4 degrees. He placed his hand on the stone bed beneath the sleeping platform, still distinctly warm, radiating gentle heat upward through the gaps in the floorboards. The stone mass around the stovepipe, warm enough that he couldn't hold his palm flat against it for more than 5 seconds. That rock was still releasing the morning's heat at midnight. The water vessels in the sand bed, tepid to the touch, but collectively holding enough thermal energy to keep the floor warm until dawn. The mathematics were undeniable. Margaret's system achieved 3 critical advantages. First, complete combustion during short, hot burns meant more heat extracted per pound of wood. Second, water's high specific heat capacity stored roughly 4 times more thermal energy than an equivalent mass of stone. Third, the stone acted as a slow-release buffer, extending the heating cycle from hours to nearly a full day. Jacob Thornton, reviewing Doc's journal entries, said only this shouldn't work. But it did. The proof wasn't in theory. It was in 2 children sleeping comfortably while their neighbors shivered under layered furs. When the real cold came 3 weeks later, a brutal snap that dropped temperatures to 18 below zero for 6 consecutive days, Margaret's system faced its ultimate validation. Her cabin never fell below 53 degrees. She heated her water tank once daily, usually while preparing breakfast. Total wood consumption during that 6-day period, 78 pounds. The settlement average for the same period, based on Doc Halloran's survey of 9 households, 420 pounds per family. Margaret used 18% of the wood her neighbors burned, while maintaining equal or superior interior warmth. The number that became legend, repeated in oral accounts for the next 40 years. She kept 2 children warm all winter on a single cord of wood. The shift didn't happen with apologies. It happened with quiet visits. First came Jacob Thornton's eldest son, Raymond, on December 8th. He knocked, hat in hand, and asked if he could see the stone box his father had mentioned. Margaret walked him through the system. Raymond took notes in a small ledger, sketched rough diagrams, measured the dimensions of the water tank and thermal bed with a folding carpenter's rule. "My father says it's improvised," Raymond said carefully. "But improvised doesn't mean wrong, does it?" 3 days later, Dutch Kellerman appeared. No preliminaries, no apology for calling her system washerwoman thinking. He simply asked, "The sandstone around your stovepipe, does it crack with the heat cycling?" "Not if you let it warm gradually," Margaret explained. "I built the fire small the first 3 times. Let the stone heat slow. Let the moisture bake out. After that, it's stable." Dutch nodded, still studying the horizontal pipe section, the way she packed smaller stones around it for even contact. "You got more of that river sandstone?" "I'd pay fair price." By mid-December, Margaret's cabin had become an unofficial classroom. Wives came asking about the sealed water vessels, how to prevent leaks, which metals work best, how to insulate without blocking heat transfer. Men came asking about stovepipe modifications, stone selection, the mathematics of thermal mass. Porter Davidson, the firefighter who called her system a death trap, showed up on December 19th. He inspected every seal, every clearance, every potential fire hazard with professional thoroughness. Finally, he straightened up. "It's sound," he admitted. "Better than sound. You've got more clearance from combustibles than most standard installations. The sealed tanks are safer than open water containers. And the reduced firebox actually improves draft efficiency because you're not trying to pull air through half-burned green wood." He paused, choosing his words. "I was wrong. This isn't dangerous improvisation. This is engineering." The adoption spread organically, modified to each household's needs and resources. The blacksmith, Owen Fletcher, began fabricating water tanks from salvaged metal, sealed units specifically designed for thermal storage. He sold 11 between December and February, each one an iteration on Margaret's original design. Jacob Thornton built a smaller version of the stone thermal bed beneath his own children's sleeping area. He used granite instead of sandstone, denser, slower to heat, but even better at retention. His wood consumption dropped by 40% within 2 weeks. By the winter of 1888 to 1889, 26 households in the Teton River Valley had incorporated some version of Margaret's system. Not identical copies. Frontier engineering was always adaptive, but the core principle remained. Heat water thoroughly, store efficiently, release it slowly through thermal mass. The Mercantile in Fort Benton began stocking sealed metal containers specifically for thermal heating systems. The owner, when asked about the sudden demand, would gesture toward the hills west of town and say simply, "Brennan method. Works." The phrase that emerged in local speech, used without irony, built Brennan style. It meant efficient, practical, and proven by the hardest judge of all, a Montana winter. Margaret Brennan died in 1904, 17 years after that first brutal winter. By then, her small cabin had become a 2-room house, her children grown and managing their own homesteads. Her heating system, continually refined, never abandoned, had saved her an estimated 14 cords wood over those 17 winters. But the legacy wasn't measured in cordwood. What Margaret proved, what the settlement learned, was something modern engineering would take another 50 years to formalize. Thermal mass storage systems work. The principle she discovered by accident. Using water's high specific heat capacity, combined with stone's slow thermal release, is a foundation of contemporary hydronic heating, radiant floor systems, and passive solar design. The Roman hypocaust did it with masonry and fire. Korean ondol floors did it with stone channels and flue gases. Japanese irori hearths did it with ash pits and embedded stones. Russian masonry heaters, massive stoves weighing thousands of pounds, do it by storing heat in brick and releasing it over 18 to 24 hours. Margaret Brennan, a widow in Montana Territory with an injured shoulder and dwindling firewood, rediscovered a truth older than nations. Heat storage is more valuable than heat production. One intense fire, fully utilized, beats a dozen weak fires constantly fed. The frontier dismissed her because she was a woman applying domestic knowledge to engineering problems. But heat doesn't care about gender. Physics doesn't respect credentials. And survival doesn't wait for permission from experts. Her system worked because she understood something experienced builders didn't. Desperation makes you pay attention to details others ignore. When you can't waste a single BTU, you learn to capture them all. When you can't afford to fail, you engineer solutions that don't. The irony is profound. Modern homes, with central heating and infinite fuel, are often less thermally efficient than Margaret's stone and water system heated once daily. We've gained convenience. We've lost the discipline of efficient design. There's a lesson there, buried in river stones and sealed metal tanks, waiting in the thermal mass beneath a sleeping platform. The old ways weren't primitive. They were refined by necessity, tested by crisis, and proven by survival. Every winter after 1887, somewhere in the Teton River Valley, smoke rose from chimneys in steady columns, except from cabins built Brennan style, where heat stored quietly in stone and water, released slowly to the cold, dark hours, and asked for nothing but a single careful fire each dawn. That's not backwardness. That's engineering that worked when your life depended on it. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop your location and experience in the comments. I'll respond with a traditional heating technique from your region that actually kept people alive. And if you want more survival wisdom that modern engineers are rediscovering, subscribe now. Every week, I bring you one frontier technique that solved problems we're still struggling with today. Like this video, if Margaret's story changed how you think about heat, efficiency, and who gets to be called an engineer,